Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to our deep dive here on the AI Era Islamic Abrahamic Wisdom channel.
It's good to be back.
And thank you, as always, for trusting us with your source material. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something just absolutely essential, a historical analysis that feels like it was written for this exact moment.
It really does.
We're focusing on the foundational principles of what you could call intellectual governance, laid out by the first caliph, Hazrat Abu Bakr, as-Siddiq. May God be pleased with him.
Indeed. And our material today, it's centered specifically around the insights in Mr. Zahir Ahmad Mir's work, the Abu Bakr Intellectual Governance Model. We're really looking at how he saw knowledge preservation, and evidence-based leadership as not just good ideas.
Not just optional extras for a ruler.
Exactly. They were core, non-negotiable state functions.
Yeah.
They were necessary for the actual survival of that new civilization.
And that's the key distinction, isn't it? That's what we need to zero in on. Our mission for you, the listener, is much sharper than just a history lesson. We're looking at a leadership blueprint where knowledge, verification, and truth were the main currency, the actual infrastructure.
Right. The goal is for you to quickly grasp the structural role of intellectual rigor in building something that lasts.
And how this model from the 7th century offers these powerful, really tangible lessons for our current world. You know, with information overload, AI generating synthetic knowledge, and this constant battle against what's true and what's manufactured.
If you're looking for a blueprint for stable ethical governance in an age defined by informational chaos, you have to look at models where institutionalizing truth was the absolute highest priority.
And that's exactly what we have here.
That's what Abu Bakr provided.
Before we really get into it, just a quick note. If you find value in these discussions, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and maybe share this deep dive with friends or colleagues who are also looking for this kind of structured knowledge. We really do rely on your support.
It makes a huge difference.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We're going to start at the very beginning by defining knowledge itself, not as a hobby for scholars,
No.
but as the literal, non-negotiable backbone of the state, a structural requirement.
That's the perfect way to put it, the structural backbone.
So when we look at the source material, the first big realization from Abu Bakr is it's profound, but it's also so simple. No system survives without knowledge.
Right. And you have to understand, that's not just some moral advice. It's not a platitude.
It's a strategic principle.
It's a foundational existential principle of statecraft. It takes knowledge from being a benefit and makes it a prerequisite for a society that can actually function and endure.
So it changes everything, all the priorities of the state.
It completely alters the state's priorities. It establishes knowledge, the pursuit, and, crucially, the preservation of truth as the first pillar of infrastructure. You could argue it comes way ahead of, say, military might or managing the treasury.
And the sources really break down what happens when that pillar fails.
Right.
Right? They identify these 3 critical failure modes.
Yes, and these should give any modern leader serious pause. They're timeless.
Okay, so let's spend some time on these.
Yeah.
The first one, it might seem obvious, but it's so corrosive. Faith without knowledge weakens, which suggests that if you don't know why you believe or what the ethical lines are or how to even implement your values, your faith is just fragile.
It's brittle, it's easily corrupted, and it can't sustain any kind of real social action. It just becomes a feeling, not a foundation.
Exactly, but the model doesn't just stop there with the individual. It immediately scales that problem up to the political level.
Right, and that's the second failure mode,
Yeah.
which is, existentially governmental. Governance without knowledge collapses.
Just think about that. The sheer amount of data, facts, context needed to run an early empire.
Or a modern state. Without accurate data on your people, your resources, your threats. Or, and this is most important in this model, without understanding the revealed legal and ethical framework, every single decision you make is basically a guess, a gamble.
And the sources aren't saying this is a slow decay, are they? It's an active failure.
It's an active administrative collapse rooted in ignorance. If you can't accurately assess taxes or manage a famine or deploy armies based on reliable intelligence, the whole thing fails, not from an external attack, but from its own internal incoherence.
And that leads right into the third one, which for me is the most chilling. It speaks directly to our sense of fairness.
Justice without understanding becomes injustice.
It's such a powerful, almost tragic statement, because it means the judge, the administrator, the lawmaker if they're ignorant of the full context, the law, the social consequences.
Even if their personal intentions are pure gold.
Right. Even with the best intentions, the outcome is negative. It's harmful to the people.
Can you elaborate on that a bit? Because I think in modern governance, we tend to assume injustice only comes from, intentional malice, bad actors.
That's a great point. And the model completely rejects that idea. It says injustice isn't solely from malice. More often and more systemically, it's the inevitable result of ignorance.
So if I'm a judge and I just don't know the precedent or the defendant's circumstances or the nuances of the law, my ruling might seem fair to me in my limited view, but it causes real harm.
Exactly. So for Abu Bakr, this meant education and knowledge they weren't secondary. They weren't optional benefits. But a source says they were structural to survival.
If you don't actively invest state resources in knowledge, in understanding, in sound judgment, you are actively, institutionally inviting the collapse of your own system.
That's a huge thought for the AI age. We're so worried about algorithmic bias. But maybe the bigger threat is just institutional ignorance, processing unverified, incomplete data at massive scale.
Precisely. And if your foundation is that knowledge is structural, that immediately leads to the next logical step.
Which is that this learning can't just be for a small elite class.
It can't be. It has to be a collective responsibility. This isn't about setting up some fancy academy for the children of the powerful.
Right. The source material shows that the foundational knowledge, the Quranic teachings, the understanding of the Sunnah, it was spread actively, rapidly.
And it was encouraged, even demanded, across the whole of society, from the general down to the shepherd. Everyone was part of the system.
Okay, but let me push back on that a bit. Let's introduce some friction here. You have a brand new state. It's fighting for survival, dealing with external threats, internal chaos after the prophet's passing. Peace be upon him.
A very fragile moment.
How do you justify prioritizing mass education over, say, immediate military consolidation or securing trade routes? Isn't that an incredibly risky use of very limited resources?
That's an excellent challenge, and the answer reveals the genius of this model. They understood that military and economic security are temporary if you don't have intellectual security.
So the internal threat was seen as greater than the external one.
In the long run, yes. Why was the society-wide push so necessary? Because ignorance wasn't just seen as a personal failing. It was seen as a societal threat, a deep systemic vulnerability that could fracture the entire community from the inside.
So if most people lacked moral clarity or a unified legal understanding, the state itself is unstable no matter how big its army is.
Exactly. It's a decentralized approach to security, intellectual security. If every citizen has that core knowledge, they become inoculated in a way against manipulation and division.
So education wasn't just for individual uplift, it was for communal protection.
Communal, political, and legal protection. And the sources are very clear about 4 key areas this strengthened.
Okay, what were they?
First, unity. That comes from a shared, verified understanding of your core values. Second, legal consistency. Hugely important. Justice has to be predictable everywhere to maintain trust.
Okay, makes sense.
Third is moral clarity. That prevents corruption from the inside out when people hold themselves and their leaders to a known standard. And finally, and this is crucial, resistance against false beliefs.
So if the population is educated in the authentic truth,
they become their own first line of defense against ideological manipulation. Which brings us directly to the greatest strategic crisis that he faced.
And that structural defense against falsehood, that makes this next part the real dramatic center of his whole governance model.
We're moving now from the philosophy of why knowledge is necessary to a moment of high-stakes action, political, spiritual action.
This is where the theory gets tested.
This is where the model meets an existential threat.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The source highlights the historic risk that Abu Bakr identified right after the Battle of Yamama.
Right. This battle was against forces challenging the new state, and it resulted in the martyrdom of a huge number of Huffaz.
The companions who had memorized the entire Qur'an.
The living libraries. The human verification system. This was a catastrophic loss of institutional memory. They weren't just people who knew the Qur'an, they were the guarantee of its integrity.
And when hundreds of them fell in one battle, the traditional method of preservation, which was primarily oral, it suddenly looked
insufficient. It was exposed as totally insufficient for long-term survival.
The sources really stress this. This wasn't a potential future problem. It was a sudden, immediate crisis.
It was a moment of profound and probably terrifying recognition. Losing the Huffaz meant losing preservation security. The integrity of the revelation itself was now at risk. Any delay, the sources say, would endanger that integrity for all future generations. The primary information asset was exposed.
And immediate, decisive, institutional action was required.
This is where that intellectual courage comes in, why this decision is seen as perhaps the single greatest act of intellectual governance. He was facing a situation that had never happened before.
Right. The prophet, peace be upon him, had received the revelation. It was preserved through memory and some scattered written notes. But now, a massive, politically difficult decision had to be made.
And the first reaction from some of the most respected companions like Umar ibn al-Khattab and Zayd ibn Thabit was hesitation, deep conservatism.
Their question was basically, why do something the prophet himself didn't do?
And it's a sound question. It's an argument based on respecting the established precedent. It's a safe argument.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting. This is where the story changes from just historical fact to a lesson in intellectual philosophy. Abu Bakr pressed forward anyway.
Despite that resistance, he was essentially arguing that the principle of securing and preserving the truth, was more important than the precedent of the specific method they had been using.
And that is the essence of intellectual courage, isn't it?
It is. The ability to look past the comfortable, traditional way of doing things and make a necessary change to protect the integrity of the truth in the long run. The source defines the principle here perfectly. Protecting truth sometimes requires doing what has not been done before.
And this wasn't just innovation for the sake of being modern.
No, not at all. It was a precise, surgical innovation strictly to serve preservation, not alteration. Preservation.
So let's talk about how he navigated that, because it's a masterclass in change management, driven by this intellectual imperative in the face of huge political and religious tension.
Well, first he had to deal with that fear of bid'ah, of forbidden innovation. He had to convince them, and he understood this himself, that he wasn't innovating the text. He was innovating the method of safeguarding the text.
So the innovation was in the documentation process, not the content.
Exactly. He convinced them the goal was the institutional safeguarding of the truth itself, making sure future generations wouldn't have to rely only on the fragile human memory of a few people.
And the pressure on Zayd ibn Thabit, the young scribe, given this monumental job, it must have been immense.
Unbelievably immense. He was tasked with creating the ultimate secure physical backup, the mushaf.
And the process itself was incredibly rigorous.
The process demonstrates a level of intellectual rigor and verification that's just. It's unparalleled. Zayd was told to collect all the written fragments he could find, from parchments, stones, palm leaves, anything. But here's the critical part. He had to verify every single written fragment by cross-referencing it with the living memories of the Huffaz.
Wow.
And he needed 2 independent witnesses who had heard that specific verse directly from the prophet, peace be upon him.
So he wasn't just collecting notes, he was building a robust chain of custody for every single verse. This is a system of intellectual redundancy.
That's exactly what it is. The final compilation decreed that written preservation must go hand in hand with memorization, a dual security system.
Memory and documentation working together.
Think of it like this. It's intellectual redundancy built into the core structure of your entire civilization's knowledge base. If the living libraries were destroyed in another battle, the physical document remained. If the physical document was ever damaged, the memory could reconstruct and verify it.
And fast forwarding to today, the impact of that single decision is, well, it's undeniable.
It's credited with protecting Islam for all future generations. Without that moment of intellectual courage, without prioritizing the long-term integrity of knowledge over short-term comfort, the security of the original source would have been compromised.
And for our discussion on governance, it established the caliphate's primary job as being the institutional guardian of that foundational knowledge.
It set the precedent. The state's highest, most enduring function is the preservation and maintenance of verified truth.
Okay, so we've established knowledge as structural and its preservation as the highest strategic act. Now we have to look at how this philosophy actually seep into day-to-day governance.
Right. And this brings us to a crucial and very difficult inversion of how power usually works.
Which is?
This is maybe the most radical feature of the model, especially when you compare it to other empires of the time. The hierarchy was deliberately structured so that power followed knowledge. Knowledge did not follow power.
That's a critical distinction, especially during a time of rapid expansion. It suggests that a leader's authority was conditional on their intellectual competence.
And on their use of verified sources, it creates a system where the caliph, the one with supreme political authority, was still intellectually and legally constrained by the consensus of the knowledgeable.
So in practice, what did that look like?
It meant scholars and knowledgeable companions were respected, of course, but more than that, they were formally consulted, often through the Shura, the Consultative Council, before any major administrative, judicial, or military decision was made.
But let me play devil's advocate again. In a state that's centralizing power so quickly, what stopped those scholars from just becoming powerful political players themselves?
Yeah.
Using their knowledge for personal gain or to manipulate the caliph?
That's a fair question, and it comes down to the ethical framework of the model, which we'll get to. But it was also the rigor of the process. Decisions weren't based on one person's opinion. They were based on evidence from the revelation and consensus among those who understood it best.
So the authority wasn't in the person of the scholar?
It was in the knowledge they represented. If a scholar's opinion couldn't be grounded in verifiable truth, it was dismissed.
So the implication for anyone in authority, including the caliph himself, is actually pretty severe.
It is. Ignorance was not tolerated in leadership. Decisions had to be evidence-based, verifiable.
It's absolute accountability based on intellectual rigor,
Yeah.
not political loyalty or charisma. A leader couldn't just issue a decree based on a whim.
No. They had to be able to show the source of their knowledge and the chain of reasoning that led to their decision. That's the fundamental difference between leadership by objective expertise and leadership by subjective ego.
This ensured the state was governed by stable, unchangeable principles, not by personalities that could change.
Exactly. And speaking of threats, moving beyond the internal structure, Abu Bakr had to deal with major ideological threats, the Ridda Wars. This takes us right back to knowledge as the primary defense against misinformation.
Right, the early caliphate was besieged by these threats. The sources list them out.
Yes. You had false prophets challenging the core message. You had distorted beliefs twisting the authentic teachings. You had selective obedience.
That's one where people chose which rules to follow, right? Like refusing to pay zakat.
Exactly. And just general ideological manipulation.
So in this crisis of ideological warfare, a different kind of leader might just resort to military force, suppression.
And force was used when necessary, but what was his governmental response to the intellectual war? His primary institutional action was clarification through knowledge, an active defense of the truth. He met the ideological challenge with an intellectual defense first.
So truth becomes an actively defended strategic asset.
Yeah.
And the source outlines 3 tools he used to do this.
Yes, and they became institutionalized state functions. The first was evidence, meaning facts, verifiable accounts from the prophet's life. The second was reasoning, logical, coherent arguments derived from that evidence.
And the third?
The authority of revelation, the Qur'an, which was the ultimate immutable source of truth, now secured by that compilation effort we just talked about.
So let's use an example. How did he use those 3 tools to counter the refusal to pay zakat?
It was a perfect demonstration. The tribes argued, we'll pray, but we won't pay the tax. Our covenant was with the prophet, not you.
Okay.
Abu Bakr didn't just say, I'm the caliph, do it. He deployed the tools. For evidence, he presented verifiable accounts of zakat being a fixed mandate linked to faith, not a personal gift. For the authority of revelation, he cited the Qur'anic texts that link prayer and zakat as intertwined duties.
And the reasoning?
The reasoning was masterful. He established the logical consistency. If the state enforces one pillar of faith, like prayer, it must enforce all the inseparable pillars. To separate them fundamentally alters the religion itself. It was institutional enforcement of coherent truth.
So this means that all leadership decisions had to follow this same rigorous method.
Absolutely. Impulsive leadership was rejected. His major policies, from the compilation to military campaigns, were consistently informed, deliberate, consultative, and reasoned. Every major step went through an intellectual vetting process first.
And why was that so vital for long-term stability?
It guaranteed stability and predictability. A system governed by principle endures because principles are stable. A system governed by personality or momentary whims collapses when that person leaves or the pressure changes. This made the state itself a stable intellectual entity.
Okay, but if knowledge is this powerful, it has to have boundaries. It can be used to build, but it can also be used to destroy.
A vital point. This brings us to the ethical boundaries of knowledge. The sources are very clear. Not all information is beneficial. Therefore, not all knowledge is acceptable or useful within the state's intellectual structure.
So the state had to act as a kind of guardian, defining what counted as legitimate knowledge for governance.
It did, and it explicitly rejected certain types of knowledge: deception, intentional misleading, manipulation using truth to control instead of enlighten, distortion twisting facts, and of course, false claims of revelation.
In modern terms, that's rejecting propaganda, deep fakes, and intentional misinformation from influencing policy.
Precisely. The state had to be a filter against the corruption of its own information environment.
And what were the positive criteria? What made knowledge acceptable?
It had to be three things: truthful, meaning factually and textually accurate; beneficial, meaning it served the community's welfare and stability; and morally aligned, meaning it was consistent with the ethical framework of the revelation.
That emphasis on beneficial and morally aligned is key. It implies that even true information might be excluded if its application was harmful.
Absolutely. It's a built-in check against nihilism or using knowledge for amoral power grabs. The state's structure was designed to serve humanity and God, so any knowledge used to actively undermine that service had no institutional authority.
So we've covered the foundations, the strategic action of preservation, and the operational model. Now let's turn to the legacy, the long-term vision, and why this is also relevant to us today.
Right. This model was never about a quick political win or a good quarterly report. Point 9 in the source material confirms that Abu Bakr didn't rule for short-term gains or, daily headlines.
His whole focus was on intellectual continuity.
Beyond his own lifetime, his rule was geared toward the preservation of faith, the continuity of knowledge, ensuring intellectual stability, and, most importantly, generational transmission of that verified truth.
So every big decision, especially the compilation, was designed to outlast him.
Exactly. He was building institutions, judicial, educational, administrative, and staffing them with the knowledgeable. He was creating a system that wouldn't collapse when he died. It's institutional thinking at its absolute finest.
It ensured intellectual continuity beyond his lifetime. The state became the guarantor of its own intellectual heritage.
It did. And that brings us to the final and maybe most important question.
What does this all mean for us today? In a world where information isn't scarce, it's a flood. We're fighting synthetic knowledge, deep fakes, algorithmic amnesia.
The parallels are not just interesting, they are shockingly, almost terrifyingly relevant. We face ideological threats delivered at the speed of light, where the source of information is often totally obscured or just fabricated by an AI model.
And the Abu Bakr model gives us clear, actionable guidance for this environment.
It does. Let's compare the challenges. Their crisis was the loss of human memory, the Huffaz. Our crisis is the proliferation of data, most of it unverified or maliciously generated.
So the first lesson is the absolute need for verified knowledge systems.
Precisely. We can't rely on unverified digital chatter or social media trends anymore. We need institutional structures dedicated to aggressive verification, just like Zayd ibn Thabit had to do, requiring multiple independent chains of custody for information.
Which goes right back to that heroic act.
Yeah.
The protection of original sources.
Yes. Just as the compilation safeguarded the Qur'an, we have to prioritize the security and integrity of authentic original data, making it immutable, verifiable. We have to be able to distinguish between the original source truth and the AI summary or synthetic version.
And the response to distortion is the same today. Resistance to AI misinformation.
And the preservation of authentic data. We have to apply those ethical limits we talked about, rejecting anything that is deception or manipulation, even if it's sophisticated or politically convenient. We have to apply that ethical filter to AI output.
This is where we need to relearn the importance of institutional memory, not algorithmic amnesia.
Thank you. That's a perfect phrase. Modern digital systems, they're driven by profit, by engagement. They rewrite history, they prioritize what's new, they bury what isn't trending. This historical model insists on stable, preserved, verifiable truth that doesn't change with the news cycle or the latest algorithm update.
Remember that dual security system we talked about? What does that look like in the AI age?
I think it means we need immutable, verifiable records, the compiled text, and we need educated human experts, the modern Huffaz, who can verify, interpret, and maintain that knowledge.
So if we just rely on fragile digital systems, or if we stop educating people in the rigor needed to question sources,
we invite the same kind of collapse. The historical lesson from that compilation decision is so clear. Truth must be preserved before it is processed.
if we start processing flawed, synthetic, corrupted data, if we ignore the criteria that knowledge must be truthful, beneficial, and morally aligned, every decision we make based on it will fail.
It comes right back to that initial idea. Governance without knowledge collapses. Only now, the speed of that collapse is measured in milliseconds.
So this model gives us a framework, not to fear AI, but to demand intellectual responsibility from it and from ourselves.
We cannot abdicate our intellectual responsibility to an algorithm. We have to apply that ethical filter to every output, ensuring that the preservation of truth remains the highest act of intellectual governance.
What an extraordinary deep dive.
Mm.
We've explored a model where leadership wasn't a pedestal for power, but a post of rigorous intellectual responsibility.
We saw how leadership was made subservient to evidence, how historical precedents were bravely abandoned for the sake of long-term preservation, and how education was the primary tool against societal decay.
And the foundational takeaway is still that decision to compile the Qur'an. It wasn't just a religious act. It was maybe the single greatest act of institutional intellectual governance in early history.
It was a choice. A choice of security through rigorous documentation and redundancy over the comfort of a fragile tradition. A choice to prioritize preserving the source truth above everything else.
So we'll leave you with a core principle from this deep dive, something to really consider as you navigate the oceans of modern, unverified information, as you decide what to trust and what to rely on. It's drawn directly from the structure of this entire model.
The enduring principle for any civilization, then or now, is this: a civilization survives not by how much it knows, but by how well it preserves truth.
Thank you for taking this deep dive into intellectual governance with us. Go forth, seek the truth, and remember the importance of rigorous preservation.